The stagecoach bucked and swayed, a fragile wooden cage thrown against the unforgiving landscape of the Wyoming Territory. Inside, Lydia Quinn pressed a hand to the swell of her belly, 8 months into a pregnancy that felt more like a sentence than a blessing. Each jolt of the rough-hewn road was a fresh misery, a sharp reminder of her own fragility. Outside, the world was a blur of gray sky and skeletal pines clawing at the horizon. Her husband Thomas sat opposite her, his handsome face a mask of bored impatience. He checked the time on his polished gold pocket watch, the crisp snap of its closing an indictment of the wilderness around them. Another hour to Teeter Falls, provided we don't lose a wheel. He sighed, his voice smooth and unworried. He was a man for whom the world had always bent. Hardship was merely an inconvenience to be endured before returning to comfort. Lydia said nothing. She traced the intricate filigree of the silver locket at her throat, its cool metal, a familiar comfort against her skin. It was the only thing she owned that was truly hers, a last gift from her father before his sudden tragic death years ago. It was her anchor in the churning sea of her new life as a Quinn. The world shattered in an explosion of sound. A gunshot cracked through the air, sharp and immediate, followed by the panicked whinnying of horses and the grinding shriek of the brake. The coach lurched to a violent halt, throwing Lydia hard against the wall. Thomas yelped, his first instinct not to check on his wife, but to protect his hat from falling. "Stay down," the driver bellowed from outside, his voice tight with fear. Heavy thudding footsteps scrambled on the roof. The coach door was ripped open, framing a figure silhouetted against the bleak sky. He was a mountain of a man, clad in greasy buckskin and smelling of stale whiskey and unwashed living. A dirty bandana covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes, small, dark, and predatory, missed nothing. 2 more men appeared behind him, rifles held with a casual menace. Wallets, jewelry, anything of worth. The leader grunted, his voice a gravelly rasp. And no one plays the hero. Thomas fumbled inside his tailored coat, his hands trembling. With a pathetic haste, he produced his wallet, thick with bills from his father's bank. "Here, take it." He pleaded, his voice thin and reedy. "It's all I have. Just don't hurt us." The robber snatched the wallet and grunted in satisfaction. His eyes scanned the coach, dismissing the other trembling passengers, and then they landed on Lydia. They narrowed, fixing on the glint of silver at her throat. He pointed a grimy finger. That too. Instinctively, Lydia's hand flew to the locket. "No," she whispered the word, barely audible. "Please. It's all I have of my father." The man took a step into the coach, his presence filling the cramped space with a palpable threat. "I wasn't asking." He reached for it. Lydia recoiled, pressing herself back into the cracked leather seat. "Thomas," she begged, her eyes finding her husband's. "Thomas, please." Thomas's gaze was wide with a terror that was purely for himself. He shook his head, a tiny, frantic motion. "Lydia, just give it to him," he hissed. "It's not worth your life." His words struck her harder than any physical blow. "It's not worth your life." But it was. It was her history, her identity, the last tangible piece of a man who had loved her without condition. The robber's patience snapped. With a curse, he lunged his hand, grabbing the delicate silver chain. Lydia cried out as he ripped it from her neck. The chain bit into her skin before snapping, and the locket flew from his grasp, clattering onto the floorboards. With a snarl of frustration, he bent, scooped it up, and stuffed it into his pocket. He gave her one last contemptuous look before backing out of the coach. "Let's go," he shouted to his men. The thunder of hooves receded into the pines, leaving behind a silence more jarring than the violence itself. The other passengers began to stir a collective sigh of relief and nervous chatter filling the air. Lydia didn't hear them. She sat frozen, her hand on her throat where a raw red line was already beginning to form. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent, not for the locket itself, but for the chilling clarity of the moment. In her hour of need, her husband had offered her nothing. He had watched her be violated, watched a piece of her soul be torn away, and his only concern had been for his own skin. The cold, empty space on her chest was a perfect mirror of the one that had just opened in her heart. Thomas finally seemed to remember her. He shifted, adjusting his waistcoat. "Well," he said, forcing a shaky bravado into his tone. "That was certainly an ordeal. Are you all right, my dear?" Lydia slowly turned her head and looked at him. Really looked at him. And in his eyes, she saw not a husband, not a protector, but a stranger. A coward. The foundation of her world, already fragile, had just crumbled into dust. Weeks bled into a month, each day colder and grayer than the last, as Tater Falls braced for the coming winter. The stagecoach robbery was the talk of the town, a low murmur in the general store, and a heated whisper in the saloon. But at the Quinn residence, a funereal silence reigned. The house stood on a hill overlooking the town, a monument of dark timber and cold glass, its imposing stature a constant reminder of the family's dominance. Elias Quinn, the patriarch, owned the bank, the largest cattle ranch, and the fear of most of the townsfolk. He did not tolerate scandal, and the robbery was a stain on the family's pristine reputation of untouchability. For Lydia, the house was not a home, but an elegant prison. She drifted through its cavernous, over-furnished rooms, like a ghost, the silence pressing in on her, amplifying the hollowness inside. Thomas was a phantom of a husband, offering either a cloying, superficial concern in front of his father or a chilling indifference when they were alone. "If you hadn't made such a fuss over that cheap piece of silver, perhaps they wouldn't have been so rough," he'd said to her once. His voice laced with the condescension she was beginning to realize was his true nature. It was an embarrassment, Lydia. A Quinn does not grovel. She had learned to stop speaking of the locket, to bury the memory of the violation alongside the memory of her husband's failure. Her grief was her own, a secret kept in the quiet of her room, her hands often rising to her throat, feeling for something that was no longer there. One afternoon, Sheriff Brody paid a visit. He was a man worn down by the years, his face a roadmap of prairie sun and Wyoming winters. But his eyes held a weary intelligence that missed little. He stood in the Quinn's formal parlor, his dusty hat held awkwardly in his hands, looking entirely out of place amidst the polished mahogany and velvet curtains. Elias Quinn received him with an air of regal impatience. "Sheriff, to what do we owe this intrusion?" Elias was a man carved from granite, his voice low and commanding, his presence so absolute it seemed to suck the very air from the room. Thomas stood beside him, a pale imitation of his father's power. Just following up on the robbery, Mr. Quinn Brody set his gaze drifting for a moment to Lydia, who stood silently near the window. Wondered if Mrs. Quinn might have remembered any other details. A scar, a strange turn of phrase, anything at all. "My daughter-in-law was overwrought," Elias stated flatly, leaving no room for argument. "She remembers nothing of use. The matter is in the hands of agents more capable than our local constabulary. We consider it closed." Sheriff Brody's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "All the same, it's a strange business. Robbers on that road usually just want the payroll box. They don't typically bother roughing up passengers for personal trinkets." His eyes met Lydia's again, a flicker of question in their depths. Lydia felt a tremor of fear, but also something else, a spark of connection. Here was a man who saw that something was wrong. She opened her mouth to speak, but the glacial weight of her father-in-law's stare silenced her. "Thank you for your diligence," Sheriff Elias said, a clear dismissal. As Brody turned to leave, he paused at the door. Funny thing, he mused, as if to himself. This whole affair, it puts me in mind of some of the trouble we had years back. Around the time your father passed Mrs. Quinn, Daniel Porter. Good man he was. A terrible accident, that. The air in the room grew thick and cold. Thomas shot the sheriff a venomous look, but Elias's face was unreadable, a mask of stone. Lydia's heart gave a painful thud. Her father's death had been ruled an accident, a fall from a ravine while surveying his land. But now Brody's words planted a seed of doubt in a part of her soul she had long thought barren. Later that week, on a rare trip into town for supplies, she saw him. Calder Rye. He was standing outside the blacksmith's forge negotiating the price of a set of traps, his back to her. He was as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in practical buckskin, his movements economical and sure. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth. He was the man who lived alone in the high woods, and the silent rancher, a figure of rumor and speculation. Some called him a wild man. Others said he was dangerous. As he turned, his gaze swept over the street, and for a brief electric moment, his eyes met hers. There was no smile, no overt sign of acknowledgement, but she saw a flicker of recognition in their dark, steady depths. It was the look of someone who sees not just a Quinn, but the girl she used to be. The girl who had once stood up to the Miller boys for teasing a Navajo child, the girl who believed in things like courage and kindness. Before she could react, he gave a curt nod to the blacksmith, shouldered his new traps, and strode away, disappearing into the cold afternoon shadows as if he were one of them. The brief encounter left Lydia with an unexpected pang of longing for a life that was simpler, truer, and a world away from the gilded cage in which she was slowly suffocating. Thomas insisted she give birth in the old hunting cabin deep in the Cedar Falls forest. "The air is better for you here," he'd said, his voice dripping with false solicitude. "Away from the prying eyes and gossip of the town." Lydia knew the truth. He was ashamed. Ashamed of the timing, ashamed of her swelling body, and she now suspected, terrified of what a child might represent, a permanent bond he was already seeking to escape. The cabin was a cold, drafty box, miles from any help, a place of exile disguised as a retreat. As the first contraction seized her, a blizzard descended from the mountains, a swirling vortex of white that swallowed the world whole. The wind screamed through the pines, a chorus of angry spirits, and snow began to pile in silent, menacing drifts against the thin cabin walls. The midwife, an old Arapaho woman named Tala, whose face was lined like a riverbed, worked with practiced calm, but her dark eyes darted nervously toward the rattling door. "The storm is a bad omen," she murmured, her hands gentle but firm as she guided Lydia through the waves of pain. Thomas stood by the door, his back pressed against the rough-hewn logs, his expensive wolf fur coat pulled tight around him. He hadn't touched her since her labor began, hadn't offered a single word of comfort. He was a spectator at his own life, detached and cold, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Lydia cried out, her body a battlefield of agony and effort. She reached a trembling hand toward him. "Thomas, please, I need you." He said nothing. His gaze was fixed on some point beyond her, on a future that she was clearly no longer a part of. And then, with one final soul-tearing scream that was ripped from the very depths of her, it was over. The scream was replaced by another sound, the first thin, miraculous cry of life splitting the air. The baby emerged slick and raw, her tiny lungs filling with their first defiant breath. Tala caught her, wrapped her swiftly in a clean cloth, her movements efficient and sure. "A girl," she announced, her voice soft with reverence. She placed the impossibly small bundle on Lydia's chest. a winter princess. Lydia sobbed not from pain, but from a relief so profound it felt like it could break her. The baby's warmth seeped into her skin, a tiny ember against the vast cold. She was perfect. Lydia kissed her damp forehead, whispering her name before she even knew it. Thomas finally stepped forward, his boots crunching on the snow that had blown in under the door. He looked down at the child, at her startlingly blue eyes, his own chin in miniature, her shock of dark hair. A deep frown carved a line between his brows. "It's a girl?" he asked, his tone flat, devoid of all emotion save for a bitter disappointment. Lydia's exhausted joy faltered. "Yes, Thomas. She's healthy. She's ours." His jaw clenched, a muscle pulsing in his cheek. "I needed a son," he said, the words like chips of ice. What Lydia blinked her mind, struggling to comprehend the cruelty. He turned for the door, fastening the clasps of his coat. "I needed an heir. Someone to carry the name the land. Not this." "She's your daughter, Thomas," Lydia pleaded, her voice rising with a desperate, frantic energy. "You can still love her." He didn't look back. "I do not need a daughter," he said, his hand on the door latch. "And I do not need you." He pulled the door open. The wind shrieked into the cabin like a living curse, whipping snow across the floorboards and nearly extinguishing the lamps. Thomas. But he was already gone, a dark shape swallowed by the blinding white. His footsteps crunching in the fresh snow were quickly silenced by the storm's roar. Lydia screamed his name again, but the wind stole the sound from her lips and tore it to shreds. A cold deeper than any winter's settled into her bones. Tala stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. Then with a heavy sigh, she pulled her shawl tighter and began gathering her herbs and cloths. "Where are you going?" Lydia croaked, her throat raw. The old woman's face was a mask of regret. "I do not wish to cross the Quins," she said softly. "You know what they do to those who interfere with their business." Lydia wanted to protest, to beg, but her strength was gone, her lifeblood staining the sheets beneath her. The midwife paused at the door, her expression a mixture of pity and fear. "I am sorry," she said. And then she too vanished into the storm. The cabin was plunged back into a profound quiet, broken only by the pop and hiss of the dying fire and the sharp, unrelenting cries of the newborn child. Lydia pulled the baby closer, her fingers trembling as she unwrapped the stained birthing cloths and swaddled her in the torn lace of an old wedding dress, the only clean, soft thing she had left. The wind howled, and the timbers of the cabin groaned under the accumulating weight of the snow. Lydia pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead, the tiny island of warmth in her frozen world. "Ella," she whispered the name, a prayer against the dark. "Your name is Ella." She rocked the child, humming a lullaby through cracked lips, but her voice faded and her arms grew weak. The fire dwindled to a bed of glowing orange embers, casting long dancing shadows that looked like grasping fingers. Ella's cries rose again, insistent and desperate, curling into the rafters like smoke. Outside, the wind caught the sound and carried it out into the merciless snow-choked pines, one small, fierce cry of life against the overwhelming silence of the storm. The morning after the storm, the world was remade in white. A sea of snow swallowed the horizon, where the wind had sculpted it into cruel, shifting dunes that promised to bury anything that stood still for too long. Remnants of the blizzard clung to the pines, like old ghosts, heavy and silent. The cold remained sharp enough to crack bark and turn a man's breath to ice crystals. Calder Rye trudged through the drifts, an axe resting on his shoulder, his boots sinking deep into the powder. The forest had always been his sanctuary, silent, rough, but honest. It made no promises it couldn't keep. He hadn't meant to pass by the old Quinn hunting cabin. He rarely did. It was a place of soft men and bad memories. But something tugged at him, a sound on the edge of the wind, almost too faint to be real. It was thin and weak, not the howl of a wolf or the snap of a frozen branch. It was the cry of a child. He stopped, his head cocked, listening. There it was again, a desperate fading thread of sound. Dropping the axe, he unslung the rifle from his back, his movements economical and swift. He approached the cabin with a hunter's caution, his steps making soft, crunching sounds in the deep snow. The door hung slightly ajar, a dark mouth in the cabin's snow-plastered face. A single boot nudged it wide. The scene inside sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. The fire was dead, nothing more than a pile of gray ash and a few stubborn coals that glowed like dying eyes. The air was bitter with a cold that felt final. On a makeshift bed near the hearth lay a woman, her face ashen, her lips tinged with blue. She was barely conscious, her arms curled weakly around a tiny bundle that was frighteningly still. He recognized her instantly. Lydia, the girl from the town, Thomas Quinn's wife. Calder stepped inside without a word. He moved with a speed and purpose that belied his size. He knelt at the hearth, adding dry kindling he pulled from his own pack, and gently blew on the coals, coaxing them back to life. A small flame flickered, then caught, greedily devouring the wood. The baby whimpered a sound like frost breaking. He shrugged off his heavy fur-lined coat, an item that had cost him a full season of trapping, and wrapped it gently around both mother and child, creating a cocoon of warmth. From his canteen, he poured water into a tin cup, setting it near the growing fire. He added a few drops of a dark tincture from a leather pouch at his belt, thistle for strength, birch bark for fever, and dried wild rose for the spirit. He lifted Lydia's head, his movement surprisingly gentle for a man with such calloused hands. "Drink." He said, his voice a low rumble, the first word spoken in the cabin in many hours. He coaxed her lips open and tipped a small amount of the warm liquid past them. She stirred a faint flicker of life in her eyes and swallowed. Calder sat back on his heels, his rifle across his lap, and waited. The fire grew, chasing the deadly chill from the room. The baby began to move more, a flush of pink returning to her cheeks. Her cry was still soft, but it was steady now. A good sound. From his satchel, he pulled a small object, a wooden rabbit carved from a single piece of pine, its edges worn smooth from years of being carried in his pocket. He placed it beside the child's head. Lydia's eyes fluttered open. She blinked against the firelight, her body tensing as her surroundings came into focus. Her gaze landed on him, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Calder Rye," she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. "You're Thomas's friend." Calder didn't answer right away. He only nodded once, then turned to add another log to the fire, the flames hissing as they devoured the fresh fuel. Lydia tried to sit up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through her. "What are you doing here?" "Gathering wood," he said simply. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked from him to the sleeping child nestled in the warmth of his coat. "You saved us." He didn't respond. She looked down at her daughter, her tiny face peaceful for the first time. "He left us," she said, the words tumbling out raw and broken. "He just walked out." Calder didn't ask who. He already knew the measure of Thomas Quinn. Instead, he stood, moved to a dusty shelf, and took down a small pot. He filled it with snow from a bucket near the door and set it on the grate over the fire. He moved without noise, without fuss, every action precise and intentional. Lydia watched him dazed. "You live alone out here?" He nodded, not looking up from his task of finding what little food the cabin held. "Better that way." The cabin slowly filled with the scent of wood smoke and melting snow. The wind outside had died completely, leaving a world wrapped in a profound stillness. Lydia leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. Her body ached, and her heart felt like a shattered piece of glass, but her daughter slept on, safe, in the arms of a stranger who had spoken fewer than a dozen words. Calder set a tin bowl of thin broth beside her. "You need to eat," he said. She looked up at him. He met her gaze directly for the first time, and she saw something ancient in his eyes. Weariness, yes, but also a steadiness that was as solid as the mountains around them. There was no pity in his look, only a quiet, pragmatic acceptance of the situation. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned to split the frozen logs he'd brought in from outside. The baby stirred her tiny fingers, uncurling to brush against the wooden rabbit. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lydia Quinn did not feel alone. In the days that followed, the cabin became a small island of warmth in a sea of white. A fragile peace settled between its four walls, built not on words, but on shared tasks and silent understanding. Calder moved about his work with a quiet competence that Lydia found deeply soothing. He taught her how to bank the fire so it would last through the night, how to read the tracks of snowshoe hares in the drifts, and how to listen to the language of the forest, the groan of snow-laden branches, the distant cry of a hawk. One evening, as the fire cracked low, and Ella slept peacefully in a makeshift crib Calder had fashioned from a packing crate, Lydia finally found her voice. "I never wanted this," she said quietly, her gaze lost in the flames. Calder was sharpening his hatchet by the fire, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel, a steady counterpoint to her words. He didn't look up. The marriage, she clarified. The name, the lie of it all. "I was 17 when Thomas started courting me. My mother warned me he was too polished, too smooth. But he said all the right things, promised me a life away from the dust and hardship of our small farm. I thought he was offering me freedom." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "When I told him I was pregnant, he turned pale. Said he needed time. Then his father stepped in. Suddenly there was a wedding. No one asked me what I wanted. They just bought a dress and told me to smile." Calder set the hatchet down, his work finished. He still didn't speak, but he was listening. She glanced at Ella, her heart aching with a fierce protective love. They made it seem like it was all my fault that I had trapped their golden boy. They never said it aloud, of course. The Quinns are too refined for that. But I heard the whispers. I saw the way his mother looked at me during the ceremony, as if I were something she'd scraped off her shoe. Calder finally looked over, his gaze steady and unreadable. "You were always too kind," he said, his voice low. "You let people walk all over you." Lydia met his eyes, surprised by the observation. "You knew me, didn't you? From before all this?" He nodded once. "You were 15. I saw you stop the Miller boys from tormenting that Navajo kid down by the well. You stood right between them, took a black eye for it." She blinked, a faint memory surfacing. "You remember that?" "I was there," he said, "watching from the stables. Figured you had more grit than this town deserved." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I think I remember you. You always carried a fishing pole even in the middle of winter." A flicker of a smile touched his own lips, so brief it was almost imaginary. Never know when the fish might be biting. A comfortable silence stretched between them, not empty, but full of things too fragile to name. "Thomas told me you were dangerous," she said, her voice soft. "That you lived up here like a wild man because you couldn't abide by the laws of decent folk." Calder's expression didn't change. "Thomas says a lot of things to make himself feel bigger." He picked up a small block of wood and his carving knife. "Did you ever love him?" He asked the question direct and unadorned. Lydia didn't have to think. No, she admitted the truth, both a relief and a sorrow. "I think I loved who I wanted him to be. The idea of him. The way he smiled at me in church, the way he made me feel like I mattered for a little while. But it wasn't real. He loves himself too much to ever truly love anyone else." His hands, surprisingly deft for their size, began to shave thin curls of wood from the block. He was carving another animal, a small bird this time. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you ever?" She couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't look at her, his focus entirely on the wood in his hands. "I think I always felt something," he said, his voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear it. "But I kept my distance. You were meant for a better life than the one I had. And you were bright. Thomas was loud. I was young, and I figured loud was what a girl like you would hear." He stood, walked to the hearth, and poured 2 cups of the herbal tea he brewed each night. He handed one to her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. A tiny shock passed between them, and for a long moment, neither pulled away. "You don't have to say anything else," Lydia said softly, taking the cup. "I know you're not a man of many words." He looked at her, then his gaze direct and searching. "You were the first person," he said, the words seeming to cost him a great effort, "who ever looked at me like I wasn't just part of the scenery." Lydia felt her breath catch in her throat. Outside, the wind whispered through the eaves. Inside, a baby dreamed in warmth. A woman remembered the girl she had once been, and a man who had spent his life in silence finally let that silence be broken. The first hint of the thaw arrived not as warmth, but as a change in the light. The sun seemed to hang longer in the sky each afternoon, its rays holding a promise of the spring to come. The snowpack began to shrink, and the sound of dripping water from the eaves became a gentle, constant percussion. Inside the cabin, a new kind of life was taking root. Lydia grew stronger with each passing day, the color returning to her cheeks and the light to her eyes. She learned the rhythms of Calder's life, a life dictated by the seasons and the needs of the moment. She learned to mend his buckskin shirts with a steady hand, to bake a dense, hearty bread with the last of the flour, and to soothe Ella's cries with a quiet confidence that had been absent before. Calder, in turn, seemed to slowly unfold in her presence. He began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in small observations about the world around them. He pointed out the nest of a great horned owl, showed her which tree bark could be brewed into a tea to soothe a cough, and told her stories of the mountains, of the creatures that inhabited them, and of the harsh beauty of the seasons. He was a natural father. Lydia would watch a lump forming in her throat as he held Ella. His large, rough hands, so capable of splitting wood or skinning a deer, would cradle the baby's head with an impossible tenderness. He would rock her by the fire, humming a low, tuneless song under his breath until she drifted to sleep. One morning, she found him carving something by the hearth. It was a small plaque of smooth, pale cedar wood. With the tip of his knife, he was meticulously etching 4 letters deep and bold. E-L-L-A. When he was finished, he hung it above the makeshift crib. Lydia pressed a hand to her lips, her eyes shimmering. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That night, as the last of the evening light bled from the sky, a new sound intruded on their quiet world, the crunch of hooves on melting snow and the creak of a wagon's wheels. Lydia saw them first through the single cabin window. 2 riders, their coats too fine for the wilderness, followed by a wagon driven by a man whose rigid posture she recognized instantly. Thomas. Calder was behind the cabin, the rhythmic thud of his axe splitting firewood echoing in the crisp air. "They're here," Lydia said, her voice tight with a fear she thought she had conquered. He didn't ask who. He set the axe carefully against the chopping block and walked to the front of the cabin, wiping his hands on his trousers. By the time the wagon creaked to a stop, Calder was waiting, arms crossed, his stance as solid and unyielding as the ancient pines behind him. Thomas dismounted, flicking a piece of slush from his pristine leather gloves with a gesture of profound distaste. He surveyed the rustic cabin with a curled lip. Well, I didn't think you'd survive this long up here, Lydia. Let alone with company." Lydia stepped out onto the small porch, positioning herself beside Calder. She mirrored his stance, folding her arms across her chest. "Why are you here, Thomas?" His smile was a thin, cruel line that did not reach his eyes. "Your mother has been making a nuisance of herself, weeping all over town about her lost daughter. My father finds such public displays of emotion tiresome. He says a scandal doesn't pair well with the spring thaw." "I wasn't lost," Lydia replied, her voice low and controlled. "You abandoned me." Thomas waved a dismissive hand. "Semantics. I'm not here to debate the past." He reached inside his coat and pulled out a sheaf of folded papers, tossing them onto the damp ground between them. They landed with a soft, wet thud. "Sign them," he ordered. "It's a legal document. You waive all claims. To the family name, to any property, to any inheritance. The child," he said the word as if it tasted foul, "gets nothing. A clean break." The cold bit deep into Lydia's bones. He hadn't come for her. He had come to erase her, to formally excise her and her daughter from his life, as if they were nothing more than a bad debt to be settled. Calder took one slow, deliberate step forward. It was a small movement, but it was enough. Thomas's smug expression faltered his eyes, darting to the silent man who now stood between him and Lydia. "If you want her to sign anything," Calder said, his voice like the grinding of stones, "you'll have to come through me." A thick, tense silence fell over the clearing. The two hired men behind Thomas shifted in their saddles, their hands hovering near the pistols at their belts. But Calder didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the rifle that was leaning against the cabin wall just inside the door. He just stood as immovable as the mountain at his back. Thomas's fear quickly curdled into venom. "You always did have a soft spot for her, didn't you, Rye?" he sneered. "Even back when you were a stable boy smelling of manure. Is that what this is? Playing house with my leftovers?" Calder's eyes, dark and flat, never left Thomas. His silence was more menacing than any threat. Defeated, Thomas turned his spite on Lydia. "Sign the papers or don't. Makes no difference to me. But my father will not be defied. You will be left with nothing." He swung himself back onto his horse, pulling hard on the reins. The wagon creaked into motion, turning in a wide, clumsy arc. They rode away without a backward glance, their tracks immediately beginning to fill with muddy water. They had come and gone, leaving nothing behind but a set of useless papers and the lingering poison of their presence. Lydia stood frozen, her whole body trembling. Then slowly her knees gave way, and she sank onto the cabin steps. Calder crouched beside her. "He won't be back," he said, his voice gentle now. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a dawning realization. "You didn't even lift a hand to him." "I didn't need to," he said. "A man like that is defeated by his own weakness." Her gaze fell upon the papers lying limply in the mud. With a sudden surge of strength, she reached for them. Her fingers clenched, and she tore the documents in half, then again and again, until the wind caught the small white pieces and scattered them across the clearing. From inside the cabin, Ella stirred, letting out a soft coo in her sleep. She was blissfully unaware that her name, her future, had just been severed from a legacy of rot. Not by violence, not by threats, but by the quiet, unshakable strength of a man who knew how to protect what mattered most. The failed confrontation with Thomas was a turning point. It solidified Lydia's resolve, transforming her passive survival into an active fight. She was no longer just the woman who had been abandoned. She was a mother protecting her child, a woman reclaiming her own life. Her thoughts kept returning to the locket. Why had the robber been so intent on that specific piece? It was old silver, but not valuable enough to warrant such violence. And Sheriff Brody's words echoed in her mind, connecting the robbery to the time of her father's death. One evening, as Calder patiently showed her how to properly clean and oil the rifle, an image flashed in her memory with startling clarity. She was a little girl sitting on her father's lap. He was holding the locket, his thumb pressing on a tiny, almost invisible seam in the filigree. With a soft click, a false back had opened, revealing a tiny hollow compartment. "This is where we keep our secrets, little bird," he had told her, his voice warm with love. "The truth is the most valuable thing a person can own. You keep it safe, you hear?" Her hands began to shake. "Calder," she said, her voice urgent. "The locket. There was a secret compartment inside. My father, he told me he kept the truth in it." Calder stopped his work, his full attention on her. The robbery wasn't random. She continued, the pieces clicking into place. They were sent for the locket. Thomas's family. Elias. It has to be connected to my father's death. The so-called accident now seemed like a thinly veiled murder. The Quinns had wanted something her father had, something he had hidden proof of inside that locket. A fire she hadn't felt in years ignited within her. It was the same fire that had made her stand up to the Miller boys all those years ago. It was righteous anger. "I have to go to Teeter Falls," she declared, her voice firm. "I have to speak with Sheriff Brody. I need to find out what he knows. I need to get that locket back." Calder looked at her, his expression serious. He saw the change in her, the fear replaced by a steely determination. He wiped his oily hands on a rag and stood up. "Then we go to Teeter Falls," he said, no hesitation in his voice. "This fight is ours now." Their journey to the town was a descent from the quiet purity of the mountains back into the complicated, messy world of men. They traveled on foot, Calder carrying their supplies and his rifle Lydia, with Ella strapped securely to her chest in a sling he had fashioned from soft deer hide. The journey was arduous, a trek through melting snow and muddy trails, a physical reflection of the difficult path she was choosing to walk. When they arrived in Teeter Falls, they were met with stares and whispers. News of her seclusion with the wild mountain man had clearly spread. She was a fallen woman in the town's eyes, a disgrace to the Quinn name she no longer wanted. Lydia held her head high, ignoring the sideways glances and hushed condemnations. She had faced down a blizzard and starvation. The judgment of small-minded people was a minor inconvenience. She arranged a secret meeting with Sheriff Brody in his small, cluttered office after dark. The room smelled of stale coffee and old paper. Under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, Lydia told him everything: the targeted robbery, the secret compartment, her suspicions about her father's death. Brody listened intently, stroking his graying mustache. When she finished, he let out a long, weary sigh. "I've had a knot in my gut about Daniel Porter's death for 10 years, Lydia." He confided, his voice low. "The coroner who signed the certificate, Dr. Mills, he left town a week later with his pockets full of cash. Always said he was moving to California for his health. I knew then that Elias Quinn's money had bought him a clean bill." He stood and walked to a large, dusty map of the county hanging on the wall. "Your father and Elias were in a bitter dispute over a stretch of land known as Whisper Creek, he said, tapping a finger on a verdant patch of territory along a river. Daniel said the original survey was fraudulent. But what he didn't tell many people was that he'd hired a geologist. That creek isn't just water, Lydia. It sits atop one of the largest underground aquifers in the territory. In a land where water is more valuable than gold, whoever controls Whisper Creek controls the future of this entire valley. Calder, who had been standing silently by the door, stiffened at the name. Whisper Creek, he repeated the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. Brody turned to him. You know it. My family's homestead was at the north end of that creek. Calder said, his voice flat and hard. We were run off our land when I was a boy. A fire, they called it an accident. My father was badly beaten trying to fight it. They said it was vagrants. But the men who came to offer us pennies on the dollar for the blackened dirt, they worked for Elias Quinn. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. The room was thick with the weight of 2 decades of injustice. Elias Quinn hadn't just murdered Lydia's father. He had destroyed Calder's family too. Their separate griefs were now intertwined, 2 strands of the same poisoned rope leading back to one man. He didn't just take your father's land, Calder said, his dark eyes meeting Lydia's. He took mine too. Their shared quest for survival had just become a shared quest for justice. But their presence in town had not gone unnoticed. A spy in the Quinn's pocket had sent word to the mansion on the hill. Elias, realizing that the truth he had buried so long ago was about to be unearthed, panicked. He summoned the most ruthless man he knew, a bounty hunter named Myrto, a cruel man with a voice like gravel and a reputation for getting the job done no matter the cost. Elias's orders were simple. This was no longer about legal papers or intimidation. Myrto was to retrieve the heir Ella using a back-channel writ of guardianship from a corrupt judge, and to silence Lydia and the mountain man permanently. To the world, it would look like a lawful retrieval of his granddaughter from the clutches of an unfit mother and her dangerous lover. In reality, it was an execution order. The day broke under a sickly yellow sky. A strange stillness had fallen over Teeter Falls, the kind of heavy quiet that precedes a storm. Then the wind came, a low moan, at first rising to a furious howl that tore at shingles and rattled windows. Dust, fine as flour, began to whip through the streets, obscuring the sun and turning the world into a gritty orange-brown twilight. Lydia and Calder were in the Great Western Saloon seeking information from the bartender when the dust storm hit its peak. The batwing doors slammed shut, and the patrons' ranch hands, merchants and prospectors were trapped inside, grumbling and shielding their eyes from the dust seeping through the cracks in the walls. Suddenly the doors were thrown open with a violent crash, and 3 figures stepped inside, silhouetted against the swirling orange haze. The man in the lead was Myrto. He was tall and gaunt, with a face that looked like it had been carved from dried leather, and cold, dead eyes that swept the room with predatory assessment. "We're here for the child," Myrto announced, his voice cutting through the saloon's nervous chatter. He held up a piece of paper. "By order of Judge Abernathy and her grandfather, Elias Quinn, I'm taking legal custody of the girl." Panic erupted. Before Calder could react, one of Myrto's men lunged, grabbing for Ella, who was sleeping in Lydia's arms. Calder moved like lightning, shoving Lydia behind him and intercepting the man with a brutal efficiency. The saloon exploded into chaos. A gunshot roared deafening in the enclosed space. Calder cried out, stumbling back, his hand clutching his shoulder where a dark red stain was already blossoming on his shirt. He was injured out of the main fight, but he managed to draw his pistol, his face pale but his eyes blazing with defiance, keeping the other henchmen at bay. Myrto seized the advantage. He grabbed Lydia, his fingers digging into her arm like talons, while his remaining man snatched the screaming Ella from her grasp. "It's over," Murdo sneered in her ear. He shoved her into the center of the room. "Your father was a fool just like you," he taunted, his voice low and cruel for her ears only. Elias Quinn offered him a fortune for that pathetic piece of land. But he had to be noble, had to hold on to the proof he had against Quinn. To prove his point, he pulled a small folded piece of parchment from his coat pocket. It was yellowed with age. "Recognize this. It was tucked inside that little locket of yours. A forged deed signed with a dead man's name. This is what your father died for. A worthless piece of paper." He thought the revelation would break her. He thought he was showing her the futility of her fight. He was wrong. Seeing the document, the very truth her father had died to protect, didn't fill her with despair. It filled her with a white-hot rage. This was her chance. Her audience was the entire town, trapped by the storm, their eyes wide with fear and morbid curiosity. She wrenched her arm from Murdo's grasp and took a step forward into the center of the dimly lit saloon. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It rang out clear and strong, cutting through the howl of the wind. "That paper is not worthless," she cried, pointing a shaking finger at the document. "It is proof that Elias Quinn is a thief and a murderer." A collective gasp went through the crowd. "He murdered my father, Daniel Porter, for his land." She continued, her voice gaining strength. "He wanted Whisper Creek for its water, and my father wouldn't sell. So he had him killed and called it an accident." She turned her eyes, finding Calder, who was leaning against the bar, his face grim with pain, but his gun still steady. "And he is the man who drove the Rye family from their home years ago. He burned them out and stole their land, the very same land. Ask him." Her gaze swept across the faces in the room, men and women she had known her whole life. "How many of you have lost your land to Elias Quinn's bank? How many of you have been squeezed and threatened by his power? He preys on the weak, he buys the law, and he silences anyone who stands against him. Today, he sent these men to kill me and steal my child to cover his crimes." A low murmur rippled through the saloon. She was speaking their truths, voicing the resentments and fears they had all harbored in secret for years. Sheriff Brody, who had been quietly positioned near the back of the room, made his move. He drew his pistol. "Myrto," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "Put the child down. It's over." Myrto looked around, seeing the tide turning against him. The faces of the townspeople were no longer fearful. They were hard with anger. He was no longer facing one woman and an injured man. He was facing the entire town. With a curse, he shoved Ella into the arms of the nearest person, the bartender's wife, and raised his hands. The fight was over. Lydia hadn't won with a gun. She had won with the truth. As the dust storm raged outside, the corrupt empire of Elias Quinn began to crumble from within, brought down by the voice of a single defiant woman. As the wind died down and the orange dust settled back to earth, a new kind of clarity dawned on Teeter Falls. The truth once spoken aloud could not be unsaid. Backed by the testimony of a dozen emboldened townspeople and the confession of a cornered Murdo, Sheriff Brody rode up to the mansion on the hill. The arrest of Elias Quinn was a quiet, almost anticlimactic affair. The granite-faced patriarch, stripped of his power and influence, seemed to shrink before their eyes, becoming just a tired, bitter old man. His empire of fear, built over decades, was dismantled in a single afternoon. Thomas was left with nothing. The bank's assets were frozen, the ranch foreclosed upon the Quinn name, a synonym for disgrace. Lydia saw him one last time on the main street. He was a pathetic figure, his fine clothes looking rumpled and out of place, on a man so thoroughly broken. He tried to speak to her, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. Lydia simply met his gaze, holding it for a long moment, then turned and walked away, leaving him to the ruins of his life. In the small office of the town, Dr. Lydia watched as her child's namesake tended to Calder's wound. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, a painful but not a mortal injury. As the doctor bandaged him up, Calder's eyes met hers over the old man's head. A silent conversation passed between them, one of relief, of gratitude, and of a shared future that had against all odds been won. When the doctor was finished, Lydia walked to his side. She reached out and took his good hand in hers, her small fingers lacing through his large, calloused ones. It was the true beginning. Months later, under the brilliant, cloudless sky of a Wyoming summer, then they stood on a hill overlooking Whisper Creek. The land was theirs now, the deed recovered from the evidence locker and cleared of all fraudulent claims legally in her name. The creek shimmered in the sunlight, a ribbon of life-giving silver, and the valley below was lush and green. Lydia held the silver locket in her palm. Sheriff Brody had returned it to her. It felt different now, not a vessel of grief, but a symbol of resilience. She opened it, looking at the two empty spaces where her father's picture and the secret document had once rested. A gentle breeze rustled the tall grasses around them, and she felt the last vestiges of her old sorrow lift from her shoulders and drift away on the wind. With a soft click, she closed the locket. "Time for new memories," she whispered. Calder came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Ella, now a babbling, happy toddler, reached out from Lydia's arms, her tiny hands trying to catch the sunbeams. Calder placed his hand over Lydia's, his warmth covering hers as she clutched the locket. Together, they looked out at the vast, beautiful, and empty land, a canvas on which they would build their home, their family, and their legacy. It was not a place the world had given them. It was a place they had made together.